Socrates' Apology in Crito. I've got a couple of other videos to give you a lot of information on that, but I want to give you a little bit of my take. In the Apology, this is not, I'm sorry, this is his defense. He's on trial, accused of atheism and corrupting the morals of the youth. And in his defense, about line 135, he defends himself, first of all, against the charge of atheism or impiety, which in the ancient world, the thought was if the city tolerates somebody who speaks against the gods or doesn't believe in the gods, that he may punish the whole city, kind of collective responsibility. And he appeals to the oracle at Delphi, actually, that a friend of his went to the oracle at Delphi. Lines about 85 to 105. Asked if anybody was wiser than Socrates, and the oracle said no. And Socrates said his first response is, that can't be right. I don't know anything. And so he kind of set out to try to figure this out. And he went questioning people who were supposed to know a lot, and discovered that they didn't know any more than he did. And this, of course, made some people angry. And so, in a way, he realized that the God was speaking the truth, lines about 135 to 145, that he was the wisest because he knew he didn't know anything. And that may not seem like much, but it put him one step ahead of everybody who thought they knew more than they actually did. You ever thought about why we call second-year students sophomores? The word sophomore comes from two Greek words, sophos, which is wise, Sophia is wisdom, and moros, which means fool. It's where we get our word moron. Why do we call second-year students wise fools? Because that's what sophomore literally means. Well, the answer is because they've got 1 year under their belt, and so they've learned a little bit, and they tend to think that they know more than they actually do. Now, a couple points about this. How does this defend him against the charge of atheism? Well, if I'm doing what the God called me, appointed me to do, going around raising questions, getting people to think, how can you say I'm an atheist? This is what the God has called me to do and to be. As for corrupting the youth, beginning about line 145, he points out that there was a group of young men who, were rich, so they didn't have to work. They had lots of free time, and they enjoyed listening to him cross-examine people, and they enjoyed the intellectual stimulation. They started doing it too, and people in power don't like people who ask questions. And so that's, he says, is what's behind that charge. But then he in the next section, lines about 165 and following, you get an example of what's called the Socratic method. He asks questions of his accuser, who is improving the youth, and Meletus says everybody basically but Socrates. And then about line 215, he starts raising questions about that. Is this also true in the case of horses? That, only one person doesn't know how to properly train a horse, and everybody else in the world does? Isn't it rather the other way around? You can use training hunting dogs, coaching a sport. Those of you who are student athletes, can just anybody coach you in a way that's going to help you to get better? Or is it that there's only a few people who know how to do that, to bring out the best in the talent you have and help you develop it? And so he continues this line of questioning. Would anybody prefer to live among bad citizens rather than good ones? Well, nobody would like to live in a bad neighborhood, because bad people are likely to harm you, right? And line 235, when you say I'm corrupting the youth, are you saying I do it intentionally or unintentionally? And Meletus says intentionally. And Socrates says, well, that doesn't make any sense. Because if I were deliberately teaching young people to be bad people, wouldn't I sooner or later wind up being harmed by them? I mean, suppose that I were to offer a course in how to break into people's homes without getting caught. Sooner or later, if I'm teaching that, what's going to happen? Isn't somebody going to use what I've taught them to break into my house? Now, what Socrates is doing here is a standard philosophical technique called the reductio ad absurdum, where you take your opponent's position and you show that if you carry that out to its logical conclusion, it makes no sense. You're saying I'm intentionally making young people worse, even though sooner or later, by doing that, I would cause myself to be harmed by them. It makes no sense. Okay. And in fact, he's arguing that the whole of the charges against him makes no sense. But now there's a deeper method behind this, though, for the Socratic method, this method of uncovering truth by asking questions. There's a branch of philosophy that deals with the problem of knowledge. How do we know things? How do we know anything? What is the nature of knowledge? What does it mean to say we know something? And that branch of philosophy is called epistemology. And in epistemology, there are two classic schools of thought. The one that's more prevalent in modern society is called empiricism. Empiricism says that knowledge comes from observations using our senses. Seeing is believing. This is what's behind all of modern science. But the classic alternative, and this is where Socrates is coming from, is called rationalism. The idea of rationalism is that knowledge comes by clarifying our thinking, refining our concepts, our ideas. And what Socrates is all about is, you say we ought to be good, and we ought to be good, but what does it mean to be good? What is it that all good actions have in common that makes them good? After all, if you don't know what goodness is, how can you possibly achieve it? If you don't know what justice is, how can you create a just society? People throw these kind of words around, but what they mean is often very different things. I'm going to use an example, and that is what would be a just or fair system of taxes. In American politics today, basically for Republicans, conservatives, fair taxes is where everybody is paying the same proportion. Well, for Democrats, for progressives, a fair tax system would be one where those who are benefiting more by our economic system, those who are wealthier, pay a higher proportion of their income. See, they both use the word fairness or justice, but what they mean by that are completely different things. For Socrates, the way we obtain knowledge is by clarifying our concepts, our ideas, our thoughts, our beliefs. And you refine them by questioning. We talk about goodness, but what is it that makes certain actions good or bad? Lines 375 to 385, he actually thinks he is doing Athens a favor, and he compares himself to a gadfly, or like a horsefly. Now, I don't know if you know what a horsefly is. They look like a housefly on steroids. They're the same shape, but they're much, much bigger. And there's one other very important difference. Horseflies bite. And when a horsefly bites you, trust me, because I've been bitten by one, it hurts much more than like a mosquito. Mosquito bites itch. Horsefly bites hurt. And he compares Athens to this big horse, like the Budweiser Clydesdales. They're too big for anybody to ever ride. They were bred to pull wagons and plows, heavy loads. They're bred for strength, not for speed. That's why you never see one run in the Kentucky Derby. They're huge. Their back is about 6 feet off the ground. And they're like 3 feet wide. They're humongous. But because they're big, they're a little sluggish. I mean, they don't run very fast. I'm going to use an analogy. Sorry if any of you are on the football team. Who's faster, the wide receivers and defensive backs or the linemen? Well, generally it's the little guys. Why? Because, the big guys have more to carry with them. Their job, if you're an offensive lineman, is to open up holes for the running backs to run through and to protect the quarterback so he has enough time to throw the ball. Okay? They need strength and size more than they need speed. And that size generally comes with a penalty of being slower than the smaller guys. Now, if you happen to be an offensive or defensive lineman, I'm old school. I believe games are won and lost in the trenches. If you don't do your job, it doesn't matter what the speedy guys do. It's not going to be successful. But that Athens is like this big horse that's a little slow, and by stinging it, he is prompting them to action. He is asking them troubling questions, making them think. People are intellectually lazy. They don't want to think. People want nice, easy answers, the kind that fit on bumper stickers. Make America great again. Trouble with those kind of solutions is they're almost always wrong. Complicated problems don't have answers that fit on bumper stickers. People don't want to think. They want somebody to give them their answers. Some of you don't want to read the assignments. You want to read a paragraph on Wikipedia. It's not going to cut it. Okay. Education, you get out of it what you put in. Okay. The person who does the work is the one who gets the knowledge. Socrates is doing them a favor by trying to make them think. And if they will do that, he thinks they'll be better off. They'll be better people. They'll make Athens a better place to live. Well, he is convicted by majority vote of the jury. And by his time, that was 501 people, so there could not be a tie. And then they proceed to the penalty phase, and the way that worked is that the accusers propose one penalty, the defendant proposes another, and the jury then has to choose between those two. They cannot create a third alternative. The accusers propose death, probably thinking that will get Socrates to propose banishment, and banishment is probably what they really wanted, just to get him out of town, out of their hair. But Socrates is convinced that he's doing Athens a favor. He thinks they ought to put him up in the town hall the way they did with Olympic champions, and by the way, the original Olympic Games were a Greek invention. The modern Olympics started a little over 100 years ago. The jury sentences him to die, and he responds that he's not afraid of death. In the second thing I give you in that reading on Socrates is part of a dialogue called the Crito, where Socrates is in prison awaiting execution. He was sentenced at the beginning of a religious holiday, and no one could be put to death during the holiday. It's kind of like, and I don't want to get into a debate over the death penalty here. For the record, I'm opposed. But even if you support it, would you want it carried out on Christmas Day? I mean, isn't there just something that rubs you the wrong way about that? And that the holiday ended when the ship came back from the sacred island of Delos, which is the reference in the Crito to the ship returning. And Crito, who's one of Socrates' friends, comes and tries to talk him into letting him bribe the guards and get him out of jail and out of town. And once they leave the area of Athens, when they get to another city, they're in a different country. Greece was never a politically unified country until Alexander the Great. Each city and the countryside around it was a separate country. They all spoke the same language. They shared a common culture. They knew that. They thought of themselves as fellow Greeks, but they were citizens of different countries. And Socrates, you gotta, this has its appeal, right? You've been convicted of a crime that you didn't commit and sentenced to death, and you don't deserve it. And here you have an opportunity to save yourself. And Socrates says we don't need to be worried about what other people think. We need to focus on what is the right thing to do. And Socrates responds to that in several ways. He points out that line about 840, 845, that it would be hypocritical now. He had said at his trial that he would prefer to die rather than have to leave Athens, because that was his home. That's where he lived his whole life. He's an old man. And wouldn't he then be becoming exactly the kind of person that his accusers say that he is? About line 890 to 920, he articulates an argument where the laws are like parents, and you either have to obey them or persuade them that they're wrong. When I was a kid, if I wanted to do something, my parents said no. Up to a point, I could try to get them to change their mind. To try to persuade them that that I should be allowed to do this. But when Mom or Dad said I said no and that's final, then that's the end of the discussion. If I, because parents have rights that children don't have. Likewise, he says the laws and the community that makes the laws is more important than the individual. And just as, if your mother punishes you, you either have to persuade her that to change her mind, or you have to accept the punishment. It's generally acceptable if mom decides to apply the Board of Education to your seat of learning, but it's not acceptable for you to punch mom in the nose when she goes to discipline you. The laws are like parents. In about line 925 to 955 or so, he articulates a slightly different argument, a kind of social contract, where Athens allowed anybody who wasn't happy with their form of government to take their property and leave. If you own land, sell your land, take the money, go live anywhere you want to. Don't let the door hit you where God split you. And by staying, he says he had agreed to at least work within the system to change anything that he thought needed changing. That it's one thing to debate, to peacefully protest. It's something entirely different to try to overthrow the government. And so he refuses. Now, if these things were being said by somebody in a position of power, I think it would come across one way. Are there things that a peer can say to you that someone in a position of power cannot get away with saying to you? I suspect there are. Socrates, though, is not saying this from a position of power. He's saying this from a position of someone who is going to be put to death, and who was put to death, and history has judged his execution to be unjust. I think that gives it a kind of moral authority that to use a modern parallel with all the protest movement going on, it's one thing if President Trump condemns violence. It's another when the family of the victim condemns violence. Which one carries more weight? I say it's when the family of the victim says it. Because I think they have a greater moral authority to say, no, this is not the right way to respond. And by the way, it's counterproductive. It plays into the hands of those who would take law and order at any price. I think Dr. King was right. The way to bring about change is through nonviolent protest. Think about that with Socrates.